Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Petite to Queen's Claim Your Career Crown podcast. I'm your host, Lynn, and today I'm joined by our very special guest, Allison Fine. So Allison is a clinical social worker supporting clients with both emotional and physical challenges in Seattle. She founded the Center for Chronic Illness in 2016 to better meet the emotional needs of those impacted by ongoing health challenges. Allison has also worked as a therapist in private practice, specializing with the population for the past 15 years. And Allison, I'm really thrilled to have you here today, and we're going to be talking about how a strong community with hope and how that correlates to helping you live with the chronic illness. So welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. It's so great to be here with you, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Center for Chronic Illness.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are joining us for that very first time, if you want to make sure you don't miss a single episode, please subscribe to Claim Your Career Crown wherever you get your podcasts. And if you love the show, please take that extra moment to give us a 5-star review. We would very much appreciate it. So Allison, let's get started with this because, so much has happened since you founded the center. And we've gone through a major health crisis, in the country all over the world. But I want to sort of go back to that point in 2016. What motivated you to focus your career and practice on this intersection of mental health and chronic illness?
Yeah, great question, Lynn. So when I first started out my career, I was working with folks diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and that was kind of the beginning of my work with this population. And over time, as I got into my private practice, folks started finding me who were dealing with other chronic illnesses, and I started seeing a lot of similarities across the board as far as not symptoms necessarily, but the emotional experience of being impacted by ongoing health challenges. It impacts every aspect of your life. You're not just going to the doctor and taking a medication, but you're also maybe having to adjust your relationships, having to adjust your social life, having to adjust your work-life balance. For some, unfortunately, they're not able to work with chronic illness, so there's some really big life changes that can happen as a result. And as I started seeing these similarities across diagnoses, I felt like, well, why would we isolate folks in their own diagnosis? Why wouldn't we create a space to bring people together to talk about those shared experiences instead of, just keeping them, isolated in their same communities? So that was kind of the origin of CCI, was really just feeling like that space didn't already exist and wanting to create that for folks.
Yeah, so you really have touched then on the inspiration to create the Center for Chronic Illness. But what was the process like when you went about creating the center and the work you do there?
Yeah, so being a resourceful social worker, I initially met with someone at the Small Business Administration here in Seattle and said, hey, I've got a dream. I want to start an organization. And they basically said, oh, you're going to need a board of directors and $10,000. And I thought, well, that can't be the only way that nonprofits are started. And so I started digging around, and I ended up connecting with a professor actually at the University of Washington who I think it's in the second half of the school year, matches up her students to be able to work with folks in the community like myself and start nonprofits. And so I was paired in 2016 with 3 students, and they basically helped me understand what a nonprofit was all about, helped us set up all the legal aspects of the organization, paperwork wise, helped us file for our 501c3 status, all of these things that were very new to me at the time. And, I had the privilege of being able to work with these folks, and, that was kind of how we got started. So it was really exciting and new and different, and it just gave us this opportunity to create something from scratch that hadn't existed before.
Yeah, well, I love how you you sort of looked at what are some alternate ideas. I mean, just like what you do now, but not just going with, well, this one road is the only road to follow. So that innovation also helps, I think, with how you are thinking and how you're working with people. So I think let's sort of dive into that. How can people begin to process, if they have a chronic disease diagnosis?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think often at the beginning, there's a lot of shock and
Yeah.
uncertainty and fear. And so oftentimes people need to sit with that for a while. And, depending on the person, sometimes they want to
Yeah.
sit with loved ones in that, and sometimes they want to, kind of emotionally sit by themselves and process that. But oftentimes, after they get through that very initial, like, this is your diagnosis, this is what's going to happen process, they start to realize, oh, it might be helpful if I connected with others who understood what I was going through. And sometimes that comes from trying to talk to folks in their inner circle and feeling like people don't really understand. And then
Right.
sometimes it just comes from people, excuse me, wanting to connect with others, over living with illness and feeling like they're just not alone in that process either way. So, yeah, I think those are kind of the initial motivators. And then once they begin to connect in different ways, they realize like, oh, this might actually be really helpful for me, not just emotionally, but also for my overall well-being, as someone living with health challenges.
Yeah. So I know that a big part of what you do with the center is really about mindfulness and self care. So, how can mindfulness and self care support people with chronic illnesses, not only in the short and midterm, but in the long term?
Yeah, absolutely. So the concept of mindfulness is kind of a buzzword, but it's actually well researched as a strategy for managing a lot of different things, mental health wise, but also physical health wise. And we at the Center for Chronic Illness, we offer a Living Mindfully with Chronic Illness support group twice a month. And that's a chance to, again, come together with folks in similar situations, but also to learn from a licensed mental health professional who's skilled, I call him our guru, skilled at mindfulness practices and self-compassion. And I think the benefits are wide. For some people, it's they just feel like an inner sense of calm, and when there's
Right.
a lot going on in the body, that can be really helpful to be able to achieve that state emotionally. And then for other people, they experience less chronic pain, maybe less of some of their other physical symptoms. And so, it really depends on the person and their diagnosis. But I think that for folks who are interested in mindfulness and haven't already tried it or who've noticed benefits for themselves in the past, I would definitely recommend that as a strategy for, living as well as possible with chronic illness.
Right. I mean, and there's so many different forms of self-care. I mean, from my own personal experience, when my late husband, who had terminal cancer, he used meditation, and that was a form of self-care for him to really, not only, cope with, what was happening and all the changes, but it really gave him a better outlook. Or, I mean, it's sort of hard to say. It was like a hopeful outlook, but just looking at the journey, in a different way. And so, what are some other forms of self-care that, that you could provide some ideas for those listeners who might be experiencing something like this right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we think of self-care, our society doesn't do a great job of normalizing that for folks. And oftentimes they're like silent pressures of, the things that we should do to take care of ourselves, right? But I think, when I think of self-care as a professional and also personally, I think about what makes me feel at my calmest or what makes me feel at my best. And that's really different for everybody.
Yeah.
For some people, that's about making sure that you socialize regularly with loved ones. And for some people, it's, who are maybe more introverted, it's about taking time for yourself by yourself, in silence and solitude to recharge. And then for others, self-care is about exercise, and in our chronic illness community, that really varies depending on people's physical and,
Yeah.
emotional abilities. And, still for others, for me personally, I like to put together puzzles. It's like my calmness, and it's a way for me to be a little bit creative and a problem solve, but for there not to be any pressure behind
Yeah.
that, right? So it really varies, but I think for folks to really pay attention to that inner voice that says, oh, this feels good or this doesn't feel good, and really gravitate towards the things that make you feel calm. Maybe it's going to sit in a park. Maybe it's, making sure you step outside and get some fresh air every day. Maybe it's, eating healthy, whatever that means for you and your body, there's so much that we can do in the vein of self-care. And yeah, I really think it just comes down to trying to figure out what are those things for you individually that work, and trying to steer clear of those, again, like silent pressures of our, communities that say, oh, you do this or do that.
Yeah. No, that's excellent advice. Absolutely excellent. So, sort of tilting that to family and caregivers, friends, how can family and, those other caregivers care for themselves while and also they're caring for their chronically ill loved ones?
Yeah, it's such a complicated question, because as we know from lots and lots of research, the need for caregiver support is very high, and caregiver burnout is also very high. And because caregivers are so busy providing care, they don't take that time for themselves.
Yeah.
And so some of it is around giving oneself permission to actually take that time. And maybe it's not, a weekend to yourself, but maybe it's 5 minutes here, 10 minutes here, little interspersed self-care throughout the days. And for caregivers, yeah, I think the biggest challenge is time, and just that motivator. A lot of people who fall into the caregiving role are really, tend to be focused around taking care of others, not just in their caregiving situation, but a lot of times in other aspects of their
Yeah.
lives. And so it's not always natural to gravitate towards what will take care of them, right? But I think for that reason, even more so, it's so important to take that time. And the other thing I would say about it is knowing that it's not selfish to do self-care. I always think of the analogy we use in the therapy world of like putting on your own, mask on the plane for air before you put your child's
Yeah.
mask on, for example. And it's like, if you're not taking care of yourself, you're
Yeah.
not going to be able to take care of anybody else, right? And so I
Yeah.
always think of that as a good example of that. But thinking about, maybe reframing it as like, I can continue to provide the care I need to provide to my loved one if I'm taking better care of myself. And again, paying attention, having that self-awareness to say, like, oh, I notice I'm feeling a bit burned out, or I think I'm getting a little frustrated or frazzled, and maybe I just need to step outside for a few minutes, which isn't going to solve the bigger, challenge of
Yeah.
providing care, right? But, it brings things down to maybe a more manageable level, emotionally, in
Yeah.
that moment, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I find that even when with my experiences just taking a short walk even around the cul-de-sac, but where I really was breathing, I listened to see if I could hear, the leaves moving or birds or, something
Mhm.
scuttling, and also I'd like feel leaves, so I was trying to involve all my different senses. Um,
Mhm.
but just that was very calming and replenishing for those few minutes
Mhm.
to help. So it's once again, it's what works for you.
Mhm.
And I'd love to hear about the work that you do at the center and how people can tap into the resources that you offer.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Center for Chronic Illness, our goal is really to promote well-being and decrease isolation for folks impacted by any type of ongoing health challenge, be it autoimmune disease, rare diseases. A lot of people are impacted by invisible illnesses. They look fine on the outside,
Yeah.
but there's a lot going on the inside. For others, physical disabilities that we can see. For some chronic pain conditions, we really don't discriminate on, what the diagnosis is or whether there's a diagnosis at all. We really try to welcome anybody that says, hey, I'm dealing with health challenges. So we serve, I think the last time we counted, it was folks with over 150 different diagnoses, and there are probably way
Wow.
more than that we haven't counted yet. But really, our main program is providing free virtual support groups for folks, again, whether you're the one living with the diagnoses yourself or, perhaps you're a caregiver or, some folks don't identify as a caregiver, but they are providing care. And so we call it supporting loved ones with chronic illness. We also offer a parenting support group, so parents who have kids that are impacted by health challenges of any age. We also offer a teen support group. We really have a pretty big variety of generalized groups that allow for people to find a place that, they can kind of fit into our community. So really, if folks wanted to join a support group, the easiest way to do that is to visit our website and to check out our programs there and, see if you have any that spark your interest. Folks are welcome to reach out to us if they have questions about which group is the right fit for me. We get that a lot.
Yeah.
And then we use a web-based platform called Hey Peers, which is where we host all of our support groups. So it's a short process of creating an account there, which is also free. And then folks have kind of a protected space on the internet to be able to join us for meetings. So yeah.
Well, that's all right. That's fantastic. So I have one last question for you, and for all the listeners, what's the one thing you want them to take away from today's conversation?
Gosh, there's so many. So let me try to narrow it down here. I think, there are thousands of people out there living with chronic health challenges. I think the current statistic is like 6 in 10 adults in the US live with at least one chronic condition. And I think the ones that get the most attention are things like heart disease, cancer, lung disease, obviously, those are really important. Those are the highest, unfortunately, the highest one, rates of, ending life. And there are a lot of people who are living today who live with these health challenges that you may or may not know about because a lot of times they're invisible.
Yeah.
And so I think mostly I would want folks to know that there are a lot of folks out there struggling silently. And so if you know somebody living with chronic
Yeah.
illness of any kind, making sure you check up on them every once in a while, see how they're doing. Every once in a while, we have someone who's a friend of somebody, with chronic illness reach out to us to ask about our programs. And I was telling my intern earlier today, I just think that's so lovely that there are people out there who care so much and, would reach out on behalf of a friend to try to
Yeah.
seek out that support for them. So I think that's what I would say. It's just knowing folks are out there, they're isolated. The pandemic has made that even harder for a lot of folks
Yeah.
who live with chronic health challenges and who are still very vulnerable to things like COVID. So I think just knowing that is a problem in our society.
All right. That's wonderful. Thank you for so much for sharing that. And Allison, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom about coping with chronic illness. I know that our listeners are going to want to find out more about you and about the center. Can you share with our listeners how and where they can find out about you and more about the center?
Absolutely. So again, our name of our organization is the Center for Chronic Illness, and you can find us on the web at www.thecenterforchronicillness.org. So kind of a mouthful, but that's where you can find us. We have a lot of info on our website about our support groups. We also do periodic health education programs, other events. So feel free to check us out.
All right. I'll make sure that all the links are below in the post. So Allison and the center are just one click away. And I want to thank you, Allison, and thank everyone who's joined us. This has been a really important discussion. And for those of you who tuned in, if you have any ideas that you'd like to share, please leave us a comment down below. We love to hear your thoughts. And if you have a question or would like to suggest a topic for discussion, please email us at jointheconversation@petitequeen.com. And to stay current on all of our insightful advice, our breakthrough advantages, incredible episodes like the one today with Allison, subscribe to Claim Your Career Crown wherever you get your podcasts, and sign up for our weekly Wisdoms newsletter at petitequeen.com. So I want to thank everyone who tuned in. And Allison, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lynn. Again, I really appreciate you having me. And yeah, thank you to the audience for listening.